Leeds, a small town that rests in the rolling countryside of Alabama, is and has been a home to a wonderful array of people. In this audio series, you're invited to hear histories from a few of those residents, in their own words and from their own mouths. Once again, we're standing on the front porch of the Bass House Museum, which operates under the auspices of the Leeds Historical Society. Once again, let's go inside and leave the traffic behind, letting it become the humming song sung outside this building for more than a century. We're standing now at the head of the museum entrance hall, which once was a dog trot in the early days when Jonathan Bass built the house and shared it with his family, Rutaria, his wife, and their 11 children. Down here on the left is where we're headed. It's the room here dedicated to the military and sports heroes that are connected with this town, the archive room. As we look around us, we see the evidence of many lives that were spent, at least in part, in the military service and in the protection of the people of the United States of America. Today, we salute them. Along State Highway 119, a sign identifies Leeds as a city of valor. 3 citizens of this city received the Congressional Medal of Honor. Those are their photographs on the left wall. Private First Class Alfred L. McLaughlin, First Lieutenant William R. Lawley, Jr., and Staff Sergeant Henry E. Irwin. Their citations hang on the wall, too. You can read them for yourself the next time you visit. But there are many other names here, too, men and women, black and white, who served their country. Leeds folk began recognizing their patriotic duty long before Leeds was Leeds. Starting in the early 19th century with the Creek War of 1813, and moving along with the history of the country through the Indian removal of 1836 and that pivotal war between the states, and the Spanish-American War. The memorials on the walls of the Bass House Museum begin with those soldiers who went into that war to end all wars. World War I. Those heroes included Corporal John H. Ryan, James Parker, Joseph E. Becker, Eddie Marbury Sr., and Maurice Herbert Gist, who fought in both World War I and World War II. Others honored here from the Second World War include Private First Class Ernest Floyd Walker, Edward Lee Goodson, Corporal William Glenn Lee, Staff Sergeant Farrell Lawrence, Lieutenant James H. Isbell, Yeoman First Class Evelyn Elizabeth Lambert, Captain Ellen Harding, and Master Sergeant C.C. Buck McLaughlin, who also saw action in Korea. And Vietnam is recognized here with Virgil D. Langford. At the nearby Leeds War Memorial Park, an even more exhaustive list of veterans' names face the many granite slabs there. It's worth a visit for a meditation on their lives and their contributions to ours. Yet today's visit to the Bass House Museum is to discover a man who was not born in Leeds, but in Wesson, Mississippi. Although he moved to Leeds in 1950 and never left, he is probably considered a newcomer by many of the really long-time Leeds residents. Nonetheless, his contribution to the heritage of the United States of America is immeasurable. Kenneth L. Farmer is his name. He was already signed up and serving even before that day that shall live in infamy arrived. On December the 7th, 1941, as the Japanese rained destruction on the fleets at Pearl Harbor, Ken Farmer and his comrades were unsuspectingly encamped a little over 5,000 miles westward across the Pacific Ocean, near Manila Bay. In the early morning hours 2 days later, the Japanese struck again at Manila. In 2006, Ken Farmer sat here in the Bass House Museum and read his prepared story, which he began with a quote from the ancient Roman poet-philosopher Horace.
Happy is he to whom God has given with sparing hands as much as is enough. My name is Kenneth L. Farmer. I presently live in Leeds, Alabama. Born July 13, 1920, so I'll let you calculate my age. I shall reveal to you a portion of my life. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days as a prisoner of war. From when the end of the battle came, April the 9th, 1942, liberated August the 20th, 1945. 64 years ago, at the time of this recording, the Japanese army rolled down the trails of Mount Samat to Marvelis, the southernmost town on Bataan, island of Luzon, in the Philippine Islands. The first air raid of the Japanese forces occurred in the early morning hours of December the 9th, 1941, between midnight and 1 a.m. For 4 months, American forces, along with the Philippine Army, fought an heroic fight to halt the Japanese army at bay, but we were hoping that reinforcements could come. Actually, no one in authority in the headquarters at Washington, D.C. thought that this would happen. They believed that Japanese light would come, and it was believed that it would be quick, unannounced, and a declaration of war would not be at hand. It would be impossible to provide reinforcements from the USA. That was what the Army planners knew. Army planners believed that at the end of 6 months, if not sooner, supplies would be exhausted and the garrison would go down in defeat. It did not take 6 months. It came much sooner.
Mr. Farmer had written, "The real tragedy of Bataan and its aftermath did not begin with the surrender on April 9th, 1942. On January 6th of 1942, rations for the fighting forces were reduced to 2 meals a day, and the food ration was cut in half. In effect, the portion per day per man was 1/3 of what it had been. Immediately, we began to scrounge through jungles for anything which was edible. Snakes, birds, monkeys, animals of all kinds, along with tropical fruits, were found and consumed."
No sudden weight loss nor lack of energy was noticed. However, as time went on, the effects were soon felt. February the 1st, 1942, rations were cut again. Scrounging for food continued, but the source was drying up. On March the 1st, 1942, rations were again cut to less than 1,000 calories per day. We were becoming listless and weak, and military function was severely limited. Medicine and medical supplies were exhausted, and medical problems began to plague the forces. Early in March, General Wainwright had ordered the horses of the 26th Cavalry and the mules of the mountain artillery batteries be slaughtered and the meat distributed to the forces. By the end of March, this was gone. The average weight loss was approximately 20%. Morale had eroded and the future looked bleak. A weak, hungry, and sick army was no match for the Japanese at this point. The decision had to come. Men fighting under the banner of unshakable faith are made of something more than flesh and blood, but they are not made of impervious steel. The flesh must yield at last. Endurance melts away, and the end of battle must come. 4 months later, April 9th, 1942, I, along with approximately 22,000 other U.S. servicemen, raised our hands above our head, waving a white handkerchief. This one act of surrender is the most singled out thing that I know of in humiliation and disgrace that may happen to any man. We cannot be expected to endure. Surrender or annihilation. Each bowed now who once was proud. Reduced to nothing, I chose to surrender. The surrender came on April 9, 1942. I became a prisoner of war. The fight for Bataan was over. We were overcome not only by the enemy, but by disease, starvation, abject physical conditions brought on by the debilitating conditions on Bataan jungles, a lack of medicine, and a dearth of food. We deserved far better than the Bataan Death March and what was to follow 3.5 years in captivity. The Bataan Death March. Marvelas to San Fernando, approximately 70 kilometers, or just a little less than 50 miles. We were on this march 7 days. We were spread out over the entire distance. Thirst, hunger, and totally tantalized, forced to sit in very close circles for a long period of time. So the Japanese army could move in without the batteries of Corregidor firing on them. We were used as a shield. Camp O'Donnell, our first encampment, many deaths per day, mass burials, trenches were dug, immediately filled with water as the water level was ground zero. Bodies were patted down and covered with mud as best we could. Most prevalent diseases were malaria, dysentery, diarrhea, scurvy, jaundice, beriberi, pellagra, and so forth. Other than amoebic dysentery and malaria, I was infected at one time or another with all of the above during my stay at O'Donnell. In the summer, I became so sick with jaundice, I pleaded with my comrades to place me in the morgue and let me expire peacefully. However, they refused, and instead they force-fed me with brown sugar that was smuggled in by the Filipinos in the area. I survived, and on October the 12th, 1942, having regained partial strength, I was chosen for a work detail, destination unknown. I was boarded on a cargo vessel in Manila Bay. We set sail, and for 32 days, filth, starvation, many barrels at sea, we arrived at Busan, Korea. And we boarded small gauge boxcars and traveled through South Korea, through Seoul, on up to Mukden, Manchuria, arriving on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1942. Mukden is approximately 125 miles south of the Siberian border, in Outer Mongolia, in midwinter. From tropical torrid zone of the Philippines to frigid wintry zone in 1 month, cold, very cold. The body does not acclimate quite this quickly, especially without adequate clothing. So many were lost in that first winter at Manchuria, where we worked at MKK, a machine tool manufacturing company. 10,000 miles from home, no news, cold, constant, and perpetual hunger. The work routine was 13 days work and 1 day off for laundry, grooming, and so forth. I worked in the carpenter shop. I was sentenced to 5 days in solitary confinement once for snitching a few potatoes. I stood at attention 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., except for short 3 15-minute intervals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, a small bowl of watery soup. My legs became swollen to a strut, but they did not burst, as some did with longer sentences. 1944 now, 2 years, no news, nothing to read, no radio, no newspapers, no girls, isolated in an unmarked prison camp 10,000 miles from home, forced to work by loaded guns, obey or die. February or March, I received my first word from home, a small package. My work routine: march through turnstiles, to and fro, drop our pants, do the spread eagle, and we were thoroughly searched. On December the 7th, 1944, a day of remembrance. At 10 a.m. while at work, we were called in, rushed to campsite at double time. We did not go through the turnstiles, they were open. We were not searched, and we were told not to go into the barracks, but scatter ourselves on the parade ground. We noticed in the distance long lines of cloudy vapors that we had never seen before. Vapor trails, what they are called. Then we heard the drone of aircraft and eventually recognized aircraft by the glitter in the sun. There were approximately 86 planes. The air raid lasted until 12:30 p.m. Thousands of bombs had been dropped in the industrial district where we were located. 2 bombs fell in Ho Chi Minh camp. 19 men killed outright, 35 wounded, and approximately 25 more minor injuries. Living in an unmarked prison camp in a highly industrialized district hit by your own U.S. Air Forces. War is hell. 1945, into my 3rd year now, each day an eternity. A few attempts to escape, but they were always caught. The prisoners were then marched back to the campsite, to the parade ground, then marched down to the factory, which was a short distance away where we worked, and they paraded before us. Nobody ever made the escape. Always brought back and paraded before us and then shot. I had the mumps and was very near death again. I was struggling with a desire to live. I received a second small parcel from my mother. In the summer of 1945, tensions began to build. We worked with and were surrounded by Japanese military, civilians, Manchurians, Koreans, Mongolians, Chinese. All became very tense and nervous. On Friday, August 17, 1945, 2 days after the surrender, several aircraft circled over our camp and parachute drops were made in a field nearby. That night, we heard loud voices and eruptions in Japanese headquarters. 3 days of tension, suspense, confusion. Curfew was violated, which heretofore had meant sudden death. At 3:20 p.m., August the 20th, 1945, the Russian army entered Ho Chi Minh prison camp in Mukden, Manchuria. We were liberated. 3 years and 4 months and 11 days, I was a prisoner of war.
After reading his account, Mr. Farmer sat back in the small sitting room at the Bass House Museum and recalled a few of the events in even greater detail.
Well, I had volunteered in 1939. I was working at the gypsum company plant in Greenville, Mississippi, and you remember how in front of all post offices on the old building that Uncle Sam needs you, my brother and I decided we would join up. It was not called the Air Force until 1946. That time it was the U.S. Army Air Force. Well, I was located in Savannah, Georgia at that time. Originally at Barksdale Field, Louisiana, and then moved to Savannah, Georgia. I went to aircraft school and became an air mechanic, and then got back on the flight line and became a crew chief, what you call air mechanic and crew chief. I worked on B-20s and A-24s. Finally, that was the last. It was a dive bomber. I was in a dive bomber unit. When we got off maneuvers, we had maneuvers down South Louisiana. General Walter Kruger and General Ben Lear, the Air Force, the ground forces. We were down there for 4 weeks doing pretty severe simulation. We got back to Savannah and we were ordered not to unpack our bags, that we were soon leaving for destination unknown, and we were on a troop train through the country. We landed in San Francisco. Then we were shipped over to Angel Island for delouse and debugging. We threw all of our clothes away, and they gave us fresh clothes. And we departed from San Francisco on November the 1st, 1941. And we had no idea where we were going. We were under blackout conditions after we left Honolulu, and we were escorted from Honolulu on to the Philippines. We landed in the Philippines on November the 20th, 20 days later.
For 19 days after disembarkment, Ken and his comrades set up for an extended tour of duty in the quiet and friendly Philippines.
Everything appeared normal. We unloaded and were stationed at Fort McKinley, which is just a few miles out of Manila. We had no warnings, just as on Pearl Harbor, but as soon as the Pearl Harbor event took place, we were notified. So we knew that a war, and then they struck our area that night between midnight and about 1 in the morning. That was our first bombing. But it was all a surprise attack, the Japanese was. But we survived that, and on Christmas Eve Day, 1941, we were ordered, all the forces were ordered to evacuate to the Bataan Peninsula, and that's where it gets its name. Well, it is Bataan, but we were ordered to evacuate all the way to the tip of it and to see if the Japanese could be held on that narrow strip. But of course, as I say, it took 4 months for them to overrun us, but that's the way it happened.
The march of approximately 75,000 Filipino and United States soldiers began after the surrender to a Japanese army of 50,000 men under General Masaharu Homma. Japan was forced to accept emaciated, ill, and wounded captives who outnumbered them. The Japanese, having expected the fighting to continue, also expected 25,000 prisoners of war and did not have facilities to properly care for 3 times that number. Those prisoners who could not continue on the march, who fell by the wayside, were shot, beheaded, or beaten to death. There were no stragglers. All in all, an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 prisoners died along the route.
The burials, as I mentioned in here, that's probably the most, I don't know what to say, what to call it, but it was tough. We had anywhere from 20 to 30 a day dying for a while. The able-bodied had to carry them. And when we left with the bodies, there was a group digging the graves. It was just a trench. And when we got there, as we got one by one, we carried them over and laid them in the trench, and it was in water, because right there in the Philippines, the water level was zero, so when you dug a hole, it filled up with water. And we would lay those bodies in that water, and they'd start to float, and we would pat them down. We'd put more bodies on them, pat them down, and then cover with mud and what dirt we could find, and into a watery grave.
After that terrible march, fatal to so many, after the ordeal at Camp O'Donnell and the equally arduous trip north, the prisoners were delivered to Ho Tin prison camp and settled into a life, however tenuous and meager, of labor.
Our day-to-day routine was we were gotten up 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning in the dead winter time in cold barracks, because each barracks held several hundred, 24 to each bay, and I don't know how many bays there were, but one scuttle of coal per barracks per day was all we were given, so that when we get in from work, we were allowed to start a fire and warm up a little bit. But once we went to bed, we knew it was going to be cold the next morning. And we were served a little watery Milo maize. I don't know if we weren't served rice. I didn't have any rice from the time I left the Philippines till I got back home, because rice was a delicacy up there. It was scarce. And we were fed Milo maize. That's kind of like a Kathy corn seed. That was our breakfast, a little bowl of that watery soup. Then at lunch, we were taken off duty long enough to eat another little bowl of soup, or turnip soup, what we call Colorado soup. And then when we marched in the afternoons, as I told you, when we left in the morning, there were about 6 lines. Each one had a stile there. And before we entered that turnstile, we had already unbuttoned our shirts and unzipped our pants. And then we would go through, and on the other side, we were given a complete inspection to see if there's any contraband. The same way coming in the afternoon. We went, no matter how cold, how bad the weather was, we had to go through that. But on this particular day, on December the 7th, they avoided that. We were afraid. We didn't know what was going to happen. We thought maybe that was the end of us, but it was that air raid that they had detected. 2 bombs hit our camp. They were exactly 200 feet apart. I was exactly in the middle of those. So the 2 bombs, one hit here and one hit there. But it was a powerful position, because we were that far from home and then bombed by our own Air Force, but it was unmarked. See, our camp was unmarked, and it was amid a big industrial district. So we never blamed anybody that we got hit, because they were on a mass bombing detail.
Mr. Farmer had mentioned 2 packages that came to him during those years of imprisonment. How did he get them?
Red Cross. I'm one of those who will always give to the Red Cross. Now, a lot of people in the military didn't like the Red Cross too much, because they didn't like the way it was distributed, mostly in Europe. But as far as I'm concerned, we would get little packages, and some of it would be in cans before it was given to us. It was a can of Spam. If that was given to us, first thing they did was open it, then they give it to us. They would give us nothing that was not perishable, because they're afraid it might attempt to escape. I got 2 of those packages from home. My mother heard from me in December of 1943. She was notified by the War Department that I was supposedly alive in Manchuria. And the first package from her came early in 1944, because she got in touch with authorities about sending a package. Of course, it was limited, had no date on it, could go to no description as what the conditions at home were.
Those succeeding years would reveal another side of the nature of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. That day in August, when their forces arrived, the Russians were the rescuers, the liberators of our captive American men.
Well, we lost several prisoners in that camp, heart attack. When we heard it, we heard the crack of the gates, and we heard the rumble of the bulldozers and the clee tracks coming in. It was Japanese. It was exciting. But that was on August the 20th, 1945, when they came in. And that parachute had come in 3 days earlier. And we roamed the area. And one thing we had in our camp was a barbed wire fence. The outside wall was a brick wall, I guess 10 feet tall. That's where the soldiers marched to and fro, regardless. When the Russians came in, they pulled all the Japanese out of headquarters. They made a search of the area. And all of the Japanese that were in camp, guards and commanders and so forth, were lined up against that fence, and they took snips and cut down the barbed wire. And they had piled their artillery, their weapons, in a big pile, mostly pistols and machines, 30 caliber or 50 caliber. I don't think the Japanese had but 22 calibers, as I remember. But the Russians organized a guard detail with sergeant of the guard and corporal of the guards in the detail. And they issued everyone, they had chose one officer, he was the commander of the unit. They gave him a gun and told him to try it to make sure it would fire. And then they gave every person in the detail. I think they chose 12 or 14 for the detail. And when that squad was organized, all the Japanese were moved to that fence with their back to the wall. The guards had their weapons issued, and the Russians left. Russians left and didn't come back until about 8 o'clock that night. They had evidently told our commanders that they would be back. 1,200 of us, we didn't know what the heck was going on. But when the Russians came back that night, where do you think those Japanese were? Back against the wall. The United States of America just doesn't operate like that. But now you talk about a lambasting. The Russian commander gave our commander a lashing. But of course they didn't realize that we don't operate like that. And then they took the Japanese with them and boarded them on a rail car. I don't know where they were taken. But that was an exciting moment when the Russian moved in.
Was there a lot of gunfire? Or?
No, none whatsoever. They just moved in with heavy-duty equipment, bulldozers, carry-alls, and just began to knock down buildings and everything. And at the same time, when they saw the Japanese, he surrendered. Evidently, the Japanese had been in touch with Tokyo. We had no earthly idea that the Russians had joined the war. But evidently they had been informed, and evidently they'd been informed that Mukden had already been captured and that the prison camps were dry. So when they came in, the Japanese just gave up. That's all they could do. You ask me how do I feel toward Japanese people? I don't have any hatred. My boss in the carpenter shop was named Kawahashi, and he was a friend of mine. He talked to me a lot. He was a civilian pattern maker. Many times he said he would have been a Christian had he been allowed to be, because he was under the influence of a Catholic missionary when he was a child in Japan. About every 2 or 3 months or a few times, he would get a little care package from his home in Japan. He never failed to give me a little something out of that package. We were just more or less, he was a part of the enemy and I was a part of the enemy, but working together as civilians, that didn't affect us. And I got to know him very well and really thought a lot of him. After the surrender, I went out. I knew where the apartment complex was that he lived, so I headed in that direction 2 days after surrender, I guess, or 3. And I walked up to those older Japanese people out there sitting. I just walked up to them and asked them. I said, I came to see Takashi-san, and they didn't know him. But by that time, they had reissued 45 Colt automatics, and we had one when we left. So I pulled that automatic up, and I told the man, and I said, I came in goodwill. Takashi-san lives here. I know, he has told me. I could carry on a fairly good conversation with him. I said, now, one of you tell me where he is. So, sure enough, they jumped up and says, come on, I'll lead you to it. And when I got there, I started up on the steps on the porch, and I took my shoes off. I was wanting to be customary because it was a friendly visit. I knocked on the door. Takashi-san asked, who is it? The Japanese. And I says, Fama-san Ichi-ni-kyu. That's 129. That's what we went by. And he opened the door, and I stepped in, and he closed the door. And I said, Takashi-san, I brought a little package of fruits and gum and something I want to give to your little boy. He was proud of that little boy. But he broke down at that point and told me that he had been notified the day before that the last troop train out heading toward homeland before the Russian entered, that troop train had been confiscated by the Japanese in Seoul, Korea. And he hadn't heard anything from his wife, but he didn't know where they were. So it was kind of passionate. I hated it because, he lost a wife and a child. Well, in 1986 or 87, I wrote a letter to our congressman in this district then. He was Ben Erdrich, Congressman, Honorable Ben Erdrich. I sent him all the information that I had on the prison detail of Takashi-san, and I asked for if any of his family could be located. And it took about 3 months, but he said the diplomatic corps had made a search and they could not find any. I wanted to go back over there and see him because the 3 years that I was up there, he was the only friend outside my own comrades that I had. He was very good to me. He was a civilian. Those guys in camp, the guards, were not nice. They were tough customers.
Finally, Mr. Kenneth L. Farmer leaves you with his thoughts on his experience and history itself.
So why should you, who are listening to this, be reminded of what happened 64 years ago? It may be that you could take a few minutes and meditate on this saga. If and when our national defense is allowed to deteriorate to the point that it was 64 years ago, then other similar circumstances of that which occurred on Bataan will reoccur. And once again, many lives may be lost to the ravages of war. I wish that I had the ability to lose remembrance of what happened 64 years ago and its aftermath. But I shall never be unable to recall the episode. It's etched in my soul. You too need to be reminded of this, and it should strengthen you to be a better citizen of the greatest nation in the world. This year was the 64th anniversary of the fall of Bataan. Think on this for a moment, if you will, lest you forget, lest you forget.
We want to thank Mr. Kenneth L. Farmer for his contribution to this series of recordings and for his service. We want to thank Ron Dmitrievich, folk music arranger and performer, for our theme music, and Mrs. Sarah Lou McLaughlin, chairman of the Bass House Museum. Leeds is still going through change, but the images conveyed in this recording are those upon which the city is based, and that is history, so it will never change. This is Grady Clarkson.